What would you trade to save the only person you have left? The question echoed in Clara Bennett's mind as she stood barefoot on the frozen porch of the only home she had ever known, the wind cutting through the thin wool of her coat, while a final notice trembled in her hands. $50,000 due by sunrise, or the house, along with every memory inside it, would belong to the Whitmore estate. Behind her, a weak cough drifted down the narrow hallway, soft but persistent, and Clara closed her eyes for a single, steadying breath before stepping back into the dim warmth of the parlor where the fire had nearly burned itself out. Emily lay curled beneath two quilts on the worn velvet sofa, her cheeks pale against the flicker of dying embers, her small fingers wrapped around a chipped porcelain teacup that had long since gone cold. "It's just the weather," Emily had whispered earlier with a brave smile that did not reach her tired eyes. But Clara knew better. Medicine cost money. Heat cost money. Hope cost money. And by morning, they would have none. The grandfather clock by the staircase ticked with merciless precision, each second louder than the last, counting down the distance between shelter and ruin. Clara folded the notice carefully, smoothing its creases as if neatness alone could restore dignity, then crossed to the writing desk where unpaid bills lay stacked like accusations. Her late husband's signature glared from the bottom of a document she had never seen before his passing, ink binding her future to debts she had not chosen. Outside, snow began to fall in heavy, deliberate sheets, swallowing the road that led 10 miles north to Whitmore Manor. Alexander Whitmore, Duke in everything but name, owned half the county and all of her tomorrow. Clara moved to the window, watching the storm thicken, and for a fleeting moment she imagined doing nothing at all, letting the night close in, letting the world decide for her. But another cough sounded from the parlor, thinner this time, and hesitation died quietly in her chest. She wrapped a scarf around her neck, pulled on her gloves, and pressed a gentle kiss to Emily's forehead. "I'll be back before dawn," she promised, though she did not know what she could possibly bring back with her. The air outside felt like shards of ice against her skin as she stepped into the road, the snow already rising around her boots, each mile stretching long and unforgiving beneath a sky the color of iron. She did not think about pride. She did not think about fear. She thought only of sunrise and the man waiting beyond it, a man known for precise contracts and colder silences. Somewhere ahead, through the blur of falling white, the faint outline of Whitmore Manor emerged like a dark crown against the storm, and Clara lifted her chin as the wind howled around her. If survival required her to knock on the door of the most powerful man in the county, then she would knock. And if he demanded something unthinkable in return, she would face that too, because by morning, she would either lose everything or change her fate forever. By the time Clara Bennett reached the iron gates of Whitmore Manor, her skirts were heavy with snow and her breath came in shallow clouds that vanished into the night. The estate rose before her like something carved from shadow and stone, every window dark except one high on the second floor where a single light burned steady against the storm. She hesitated only once, her gloved hand hovering inches from the iron latch, before pushing it open and stepping onto the long gravel drive that now lay buried beneath 6 inches of white. The walk felt endless, each step deliberate, each gust of wind threatening to turn her back toward the fragile warmth she had left behind. But the image of Emily alone in that dim parlor kept her moving. When she reached the front doors, towering and carved with the Whitmore crest, she lifted the brass knocker and let it fall. The sound echoed through the cold air like a verdict. Several seconds passed before the door opened to reveal a tall, silver-haired butler whose expression shifted from irritation to restrained surprise as he took in her snow-covered figure. "I must see Mr. Whitmore," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The butler's eyes lingered on her worn coat and determined gaze before he stepped aside without a word. Warmth enveloped her instantly. The grand foyer illuminated by crystal chandeliers and a fireplace large enough to swallow the one at home. Marble floors reflected the glow of firelight, and portraits lined the walls, generations of Whitmores. Watching in silent judgment, Clara felt painfully small beneath their painted eyes, yet she refused to lower her own. Footsteps sounded from the far end of the hall, slow and measured. Alexander Whitmore emerged from the shadows near the staircase, dressed in a dark tailored suit, his posture precise, his expression unreadable. He paused several feet away, studying her as though assessing a ledger. "You chose a remarkable night for a visit," he said at last, his voice calm and controlled. Clara removed her gloves carefully, moisture dripping onto polished marble. "I did not come for courtesy," she replied. Something flickered behind his eyes, interest perhaps, or calculation. The fire snapped softly between them. "You received the notice," he continued. "The terms are clear." Clara swallowed but did not look away. "The debt was not mine," she said quietly, "but the house is. My sister is ill. If you take it at sunrise, she will have nowhere to go." Silence stretched, heavy and deliberate. He circled her slowly, not touching, not threatening, simply observing. $50,000 is not a misunderstanding," he said. "It is a responsibility." Clara's chin lifted. "Then allow me to earn time. I will work. I will repay what I can." He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the faint crease between his brows. "Time," he repeated softly, as if testing the word. The storm rattled the windows, wind pressing against glass. Finally he gestured toward the fire. "Warm yourself," he said. "You will need your strength." Clara hesitated only a moment before stepping closer to the hearth. Heat seeped into her frozen fingers, but her heart remained unsteady. Alexander watched her in silence, hands clasped behind his back, gaze thoughtful rather than cruel. "You walked 10 miles in this storm," he said. "Most would have surrendered." Clara met his eyes again. "Most do not have someone waiting for them to return." Something shifted then, subtle but undeniable, as though the balance of power had tilted by a fraction. He turned toward the staircase, voice low and decisive. "Come with me, Miss Bennet," he said. "If you are asking for time, then we will discuss what it will cost." The corridor upstairs was dimly lit by wall sconces that cast long shadows across polished oak panels, and Clara followed Alexander Whitmore in silence, aware of the soft echo of her own footsteps against the marble below. He led her into a private study where a fire burned low and steady, its glow reflecting off shelves lined with leather-bound volumes and framed certificates of ownership that testified to generations of control. He closed the door with deliberate calm, not trapping her, merely separating this conversation from the rest of the world. "You asked to earn time," he said, moving behind a broad mahogany desk. "Time is rarely free." Clara remained standing, snow melting from the hem of her skirt onto the patterned rug. "Neither is survival," she replied. He regarded her for a long moment before opening a drawer and withdrawing a folded document. "Your husband signed this agreement 3 years ago," he said evenly. Collateral included the house and adjoining land. Clara stepped forward, scanning the familiar signature. The bold stroke she had once admired now looking reckless and final. "He never told me the amount," she whispered. Alexander's voice did not soften. "That does not change the obligation." Silence pressed in, broken only by the crackle of firewood. Clara drew a steady breath. "Then give me a different obligation," she said. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. "Explain." She lifted her chin. "Allow me to work here. I will manage accounts, oversee tenants, do whatever is required. Deduct my wages from the debt. Extend the deadline until my sister recovers." Alexander leaned back, studying her as if she were a proposal rather than a person. "You believe labor can replace capital," he said. "It rarely does." Clara's hands tightened at her sides. "Then tell me what will." The words hung between them, fragile and dangerous. He rose slowly, stepping around the desk until he stood a few feet away, close enough for her to see the faint shadow beneath his eyes, the strain of responsibility that did not show. "In public, what I require," he said quietly, "is certainty." She did not move. Certainty of what? His gaze did not waver. Of legacy. The fire snapped sharply, as though reacting to the word. Clara felt the meaning before he clarified it. "You are unmarried," he continued, without an air. "My estate requires stability beyond contracts and signatures." Her breath caught, but she refused to retreat. "And you believe I can provide that stability." "You are intelligent," he said, resilient. "You walked 10 miles through a storm for someone else. That is not common." Clara's heart pounded in her ears. "What are you suggesting?" Alexander held her gaze, his voice measured and unwavering. "Give me a child, and I will erase your debt." The room seemed to narrow, the firelight flickering against walls that suddenly felt closer. Clara stared at him, shock and disbelief battling with the echo of Emily's cough in her memory. "You would reduce my future to a transaction," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," he replied. "I would redefine it." The storm battered the windows again, relentless and indifferent. Clara felt the weight of dawn approaching, the house, the bills, the fragile breath of her sister. "If I refuse," she asked, "the terms stand?" He answered simply. Silence stretched, heavy and unyielding. Clara closed her eyes for a single heartbeat, then opened them, steady and clear. "If I agree," she said, "my sister receives a physician tonight, and the heat in our house is restored before morning." Something like surprise flickered across his face, followed by something deeper. "You negotiate well," he murmured. "Very well." He turned toward the desk, reaching for the telephone to issue quiet instructions. Clara remained where she stood, knowing that the line she had just crossed could never be undone, and yet feeling, for the first time since the notice arrived, that she was no longer begging, but choosing. The click of the telephone receiver echoed softly through the study as Alexander Whitmore gave calm, precise instructions to his estate manager, his tone unchanged, as if arranging medical care and restoring heat to a modest house 10 miles away were no more significant than adjusting a dinner reservation. Clara stood motionless near the hearth, watching the controlled efficiency with which her fate was being rewritten. When he replaced the receiver, silence settled between them once more. Heavier now, defined by what had been agreed without paper or witness. "The physician will arrive within the hour," he said. "Coal will be delivered before midnight. Your sister will not wake to a cold house." Relief washed over Clara so suddenly she had to steady herself against the carved mantel. She had expected negotiation, perhaps hesitation, but not immediate action. "Thank you," she said quietly. The words felt inadequate, yet sincere. Alexander studied her expression, as though measuring the depth of her gratitude against the cost of his decision. "You should remain here tonight," he added. "The roads are nearly impassable, and dawn is hours away." Clara's gaze shifted toward the tall windows where snow pressed relentlessly against the glass. She imagined the long walk back, the darkness, the wind. She also imagined Emily safe, a physician at her side, warmth returning to their small rooms. "I cannot appear in town at sunrise as though nothing has changed," she said carefully. "People will ask questions, they always do." He replied, "What matters is who answers them." He moved toward a side cabinet and poured water into a crystal glass, offering it to her without ceremony. Their fingers did not touch, yet the space between them felt charged with unspoken awareness. Clara accepted the glass, the cool surface grounding her racing thoughts. "You understand that this cannot be treated lightly," she said. "I will not be hidden, nor spoken of as though I were a purchase." Alexander's expression shifted, not offended, but attentive. "You negotiated terms a moment ago," he said. "Do you intend to negotiate reputation as well?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. Something almost resembling approval flickered in his eyes. "Then we proceed with clarity," he said. "There will be no secrecy, no arrangement made in shadows. If you remain here, it will be with dignity." The word lingered between them, fragile but deliberate. Clara felt the weight of it settle over her like a mantle she had not expected to wear. Outside, the storm intensified, wind sweeping across the estate grounds in restless waves. The hour grew late, yet neither of them moved toward the door. "You asked for certainty," she said softly. "Certainty is not created by command." Alexander stepped closer, though still leaving respectful distance. "No," he agreed. "It is created by choice." For a long moment, they simply stood facing one another, two people bound not by affection yet, but by decision. Clara realized that whatever unfolded next would not erase the fear she had felt when she arrived, nor the pride she had nearly sacrificed, but it would be hers. She set the empty glass aside and lifted her gaze to meet his fully. "Then let us be certain," she said. Beyond the study walls, Whitmore Manor remained silent and vast, unaware that, within its firelit chamber, An agreement had been forged not from desperation alone, but from resolve. The housekeeper's discreet knock at the study door came nearly an hour later, soft but purposeful, and Clara realized how much time had passed since the storm had sealed her inside Whitmore Manor. Alexander opened the door himself, exchanging a few quiet words before turning back toward her. "The physician has arrived at your home," he said. "Your sister is stable. The report indicates exhaustion and infection, nothing irreversible." Clara closed her eyes briefly, relief unfurling through her chest in a slow, trembling wave. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe without counting the seconds. "Thank you," she whispered, not as a plea this time, but as acknowledgement. Alexander inclined his head, yet there was something less formal in his posture now, as though the distance between them had shifted by an inch. "A room has been prepared for you in the East Wing," he continued. "You will remain here until the roads are clear." Clara hesitated. Remaining under his roof made the agreement feel immediate, tangible. Yet returning home through 12 inches of snow would serve no one. "Very well," she said. The housekeeper reappeared to guide her upstairs, but Clara paused at the threshold and looked back. Alexander stood near the fire, hands clasped behind his back, gaze thoughtful rather than triumphant. He did not look like a man who had secured advantage. He looked like a man who had made a choice he did not yet fully understand. The East Wing corridor was quieter, carpet soft beneath her steps, walls adorned with muted landscapes instead of ancestral portraits. Her assigned room was larger than the entire upstairs of her own house, furnished with understated elegance. A canopy bed draped in ivory fabric and a small writing desk near a frost-edged window. Once alone, Clara removed her coat and gloves slowly, placing them with deliberate care on a nearby chair. She moved toward the window and drew back the curtain. The storm continued to rage across the grounds, wind bending bare trees into dark silhouettes against the white. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay her home, warmed again by his order. The thought unsettled her. Gratitude and caution mingled in equal measure. A soft knock sounded at the door. She turned to find Alexander standing there. No coat now, sleeves of his crisp shirt rolled back, slightly as though he had dismissed the formality of earlier. "I wanted you to hear it directly," he said. "Your sister is sleeping. The physician will remain until morning." Clara nodded, emotion tightening her throat. "You did not hesitate," she said quietly. "I did not," he replied. Silence followed, yet it was no longer hostile. It was contemplative. "You should rest," he added. "Tomorrow will require clarity from both of us." Clara met his eyes. "Clarity," she repeated. The word carried weight, promise, and uncertainty. As he turned to leave, she spoke again. "This will not be simple." He paused, glancing back. "Nothing worthwhile ever is." When the door closed, Clara remained standing in the center of the room, aware that she had stepped into a future shaped not only by necessity, but by resolve. Outside, the storm showed no sign of ending, but within these walls, something had already begun, quiet and irreversible. Clara did not sleep so much as drift in and out of restless thought, the unfamiliar silence of Whitmore Manor pressing gently against her senses as dawn approached. When pale gray light finally slipped through the tall East Wing windows, she rose before the household stirred, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders and stepping quietly into the corridor. The storm had softened to a steady fall, blanketing the estate in unbroken white that reflected the first hint of morning from the upstairs. Landing, she could see the main hall below, vast and still, the kind of stillness that belonged to power rather than emptiness. She descended slowly, aware that this house now held more than her presence. It held her decision. The scent of coffee drifted faintly from somewhere beyond the kitchen doors, grounding and ordinary against the magnitude of the night before. She found Alexander in the breakfast room, seated at the head of a long oak table, though no one else occupied the chairs. Sunlight filtered through tall windows behind him, outlining his profile in muted gold. He looked up as she entered, not surprised. "You are awake early," he observed. "So are you," she replied. A single-place setting had been arranged opposite his, untouched. "I thought we might speak before the staff begins to speculate," he said calmly. Clara took the offered seat, posture straight, hands folded lightly in her lap. "And what will we tell them?" she asked. "The truth," he answered. She held his gaze. Which is? Alexander poured coffee into a second cup and slid it toward her. That you will remain here for the foreseeable future, that your sister is under my protection, and that the arrangement between us is not temporary. The word arrangement lingered, careful and deliberate. Clara lifted the cup, the warmth steady against her palms. You understand what that implies, she said. This county thrives on rumor. Then we will give them certainty instead, he replied. You will not be hidden in the East Wing. You will be seen. At my side. Something in his tone carried not possession, but resolve. Clara studied him quietly. In the light of morning, he appeared less severe than the night before, though no less controlled. And if I decide that I do not wish to remain? She asked softly. Alexander did not hesitate. Then you may leave with the debt erased as promised. My word stands. The simplicity of it unsettled her more than resistance would have. You would release me, she said. If you chose to walk away, he answered. Yes, silence followed. But it was not strained. It was thoughtful. Clara realized that for the first time since her husband's passing, she was being offered choice rather than consequence. Outside, the storm lightened further, revealing the long drive where her footprints from the night before had vanished beneath fresh snow. The past had already been covered. I will stay, she said at last. The words were not dramatic. They were steady. Alexander's expression did not change. Outwardly, yet something quiet shifted behind his eyes. Then we begin today, he replied. There will be matters to address, contracts to adjust, appearances to manage. Clara set her cup down carefully. Then let us address them together. In the growing daylight, Whitmore Manor no longer felt like a fortress she had entered in desperation. It felt like a threshold she had crossed by will. And as the morning sun pushed through the thinning clouds, both of them understood that what had begun as negotiation was becoming something far more deliberate. By mid-morning the storm had softened into a pale shimmer across the estate, and Whitmore Manor moved with quiet efficiency as though nothing unusual had occurred the night before. Clara walked beside Alexander through the long west corridor toward his private office, aware of the curious glances from staff who pretended not to stare. She did not lower her eyes. She did not hurry. Dignity, she reminded herself, was not granted by walls or wealth, but by how one chose to stand within them. Inside the office, sunlight cut clean lines across the polished desk where ledgers and correspondence waited in orderly stacks. Alexander closed the door behind them and moved to the window, looking out over acres of snow-covered fields that belonged to him by inheritance and to her now by decision. The revised contract will be prepared by noon, he said. Your house will no longer be listed as collateral. Clara exhaled slowly. And in its place, she asked. In its place, he replied, turning to face her. There will be a formal agreement acknowledging your residence here and the terms we discussed. She stepped closer to the desk, scanning the documents already laid out. I will not have it written as obligation, she said. Write it as partnership. Something in his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. You ask for a great deal, he observed. So do you, she answered. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was charged with mutual recognition. Alexander reached for a pen, then paused. You understand that once this becomes public, there will be no retreat from speculation, he said. The county will assume more than we state. Clara met his gaze steadily. Let them assume what they will. Truth does not bend to rumor. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once as if sealing an unspoken pact. The door opened. Briefly as his estate manager entered with draft paperwork, placing it carefully on the desk before withdrawing. Clara read each line with deliberate attention, noting the precise language that removed her family home from seizure and transferred certain holdings into joint oversight. Her pulse steadied as ink met paper under Alexander's signature. When he handed the pen to her, their fingers brushed for the first time, not lingering, but undeniable. The contact was brief, yet it carried more weight than any spoken promise. Clara signed her name clearly, each letter firm and unshaken. As the ink dried, the atmosphere in the room altered, no longer defined by negotiation but by alignment. There is one more matter, Alexander said quietly. You will attend the winter charity gathering with me next week. Clara's gaze lifted. So soon. If we are to provide certainty, he replied, we begin. Immediately, she considered the image of standing beside him before the entire county, aware of whispered judgments. Fear stirred, but it did not dominate. Then we will attend, she said. Alexander stepped closer, lowering his voice. You are not required to prove strength at every turn. Clara allowed a faint smile to touch her lips. Nor are you. Outside, the clouds parted just enough for sunlight to spill across the estate grounds, transforming the endless white into something luminous. Within the office, two signatures rested side by side on fresh parchment, binding futures not by coercion, but by consent. And as the household resumed its quiet rhythm, both understood that what had begun in storm and desperation was unfolding into something steadier, shaped not only by necessity, but by choice. The days that followed moved with a quiet precision that felt almost unreal, as though Whitmore Manor itself had decided to accept Clara Bennett without question. By the third morning the snow had begun to melt, revealing the long drive where her footprints had once vanished, and the estate carried on beneath a pale winter sun. Clara spent her hours reviewing tenant accounts alongside the estate manager, her posture composed, her questions direct. She learned quickly which farms struggled after the storm and which workers relied on seasonal credit. Alexander observed from a distance at first, saying little, allowing her presence to settle naturally rather than forcing it. When staff addressed her, they did so with cautious respect, testing the weight of her new position. She answered calmly, never overreaching, never retreating. That afternoon a carriage arrived unannounced, its wheels crunching over thawing gravel. From the upstairs window, Clara watched a familiar silhouette step down in a tailored navy coat, gloved hands clasped with deliberate poise. Lady Vivian Ashford did not wait to be announced before entering the grand hall, her voice carrying lightly across marble floors. Alexander, I came as soon as I heard the storm had left damage, she called, though her eyes quickly found Clara standing near the staircase. The air shifted, subtle but immediate. Alexander approached from the study, his expression measured. The estate remains intact, he said. Lady Vivian's gaze traveled from him back to Clara, assessing without disguise. And this is? She asked, tone polite, but edged with curiosity. Clara descended the final steps herself, refusing to be presented like an afterthought. Clara Bennett, she said evenly. I will be overseeing several estate matters moving forward. Lady Vivian's brows lifted faintly. How progressive, she murmured. The word lingered longer than necessary. Alexander stepped closer, not touching Clara, but positioning himself at her side with quiet intention. Miss Bennett resides here, he clarified, and her authority is recognized by me. The declaration was simple, yet it settled heavily in the grand hall. Lady Vivian's smile thinned almost imperceptibly. The county will be fascinated, she said. They do enjoy novelty. Clara met her gaze without flinching. The county will adapt, she replied. It always does. For a heartbeat, silence stretched between the two women, neither yielding ground. Then Lady Vivian inclined her head, the movement graceful but calculated. I look forward to observing this adaptation, she said before turning back toward Alexander. Do not forget the gathering next week. Appearances matter. They do, he answered, calmly. When the carriage finally departed, the echo of its wheels fading down the drive, Clara exhaled slowly. She expected to stand where I do, she said quietly. Perhaps, Alexander replied. Expectation does not equal entitlement. Clara glanced toward the windows where sunlight now reflected off melting snow, bright and unyielding. The charity gathering will not be quiet, she said. It will not, he agreed. Their eyes met, and this time the understanding between them felt steadier, less fragile. Then we will not be either, Clara said. Alexander's expression softened by a fraction, not with amusement, but with recognition. Outside, the estate continued its rhythm, unaware that within its walls alliances were shifting. And as the afternoon light stretched long across polished floors, Clara understood that survival had brought her here, but strength would determine how long she remained. The week passed with a tension that did not announce itself loudly but settled into every corridor of Whitmore Manor like a draft beneath a closed door. Invitations for the winter charity gathering arrived in thick cream envelopes, each addressed in elegant script, each a reminder that the county would soon gather beneath crystal chandeliers to observe and to judge. Clara stood before the tall mirror in the east wing on the evening of the event, the soft ivory gown selected by the housekeeper, draping with understated grace. It was neither extravagant nor timid, a deliberate balance. She fastened a simple silver clasp at her throat and studied her reflection not for beauty, but for composure. When Alexander appeared at the doorway, dressed in a dark tailored suit that fit him with quiet authority, his gaze paused on her with an intensity that was not possession but recognition. "You look certain," he said. "I am," she replied, though her pulse betrayed the magnitude of what awaited them. The drive into town took 20 minutes, the carriage wheels humming against clear pavement where snow had finally retreated. The town hall stood illuminated against the night, windows glowing warm gold, music drifting faintly into the crisp air. As they stepped inside, conversation dipped by a fraction before rising again in careful politeness. Heads turned. Whispers followed. Clara felt them like a change in pressure, subtle but undeniable. Alexander offered his arm without flourish, and she accepted it not as dependence, but as alignment. They moved through the room with deliberate calm, greeting donors and board members, acknowledging polite curiosity, without offering explanation. Across the hall, Lady Vivian stood among a circle of guests, her pale blue gown shimmering under chandelier light. Her eyes met Clara's over the rim of a champagne glass, assessing, calculating. Moments later she approached, smile poised. "Miss Bennet," she said smoothly, "how remarkable that you have taken such an interest in philanthropy so quickly." Clara returned the smile with measured warmth. "Community matters to me," she replied. "It always has." The surrounding guests listened without pretending otherwise. Lady Vivian tilted her head slightly. "One hopes such commitments endure," she said, "especially when circumstances change." Before Clara could answer, Alexander's voice entered the space, calm but firm. "Miss Bennet's commitments are not temporary," he said. "They are recognized and supported." The statement did not raise in volume, yet it carried across the small circle like a line drawn in ink. Silence followed, brief but decisive. Lady Vivian's expression shifted almost imperceptibly before she inclined her head. "Of course," she said. "I am certain the county will appreciate clarity." As she withdrew, the atmosphere eased, replaced by cautious respect. Later, when music swelled and couples moved toward the center of the floor, Alexander turned to Clara. "We do not have to dance," he said quietly. She held his gaze. "Yes, we do." They stepped into the open space together, the polished floor reflecting light in soft arcs beneath their feet, as his hand rested at a respectful distance along her backend. Her fingers rested against his shoulder. The room seemed to steady. The whispers faded into background murmur. They moved with measured grace, not seeking spectacle, but embodying certainty. For the first time since that storm-driven night, Clara felt not like a guest within his world, but like a presence it had chosen to make room for. And as the final notes of the waltz lingered in the air, she understood that whatever trials awaited beyond these walls, they would no longer face them from opposite sides of a negotiation, but standing deliberately together. The applause from the final waltz faded into polite conversation, yet the shift in the room remained. Clara felt it in the way conversations paused when she passed, in the way eyes followed not with ridicule now, but with reconsideration. As the evening drew toward its formal speeches, Alexander was called to the small stage at the front of the hall, where the charity board awaited acknowledgement from its most generous benefactor. He stepped away from her with a brief glance that carried reassurance rather than distance. Clara remained near one of the tall windows, the cool glass at her back, watching as he addressed the gathered crowd with steady composure. His voice carried clearly across the hall, measured and calm, speaking not of wealth, but of responsibility. When he concluded, the applause felt warmer, less obligatory. Yet as he descended from the stage, a different figure intercepted him before he could return to her. Thomas Hargrove, the attorney who had once delivered the foreclosure notice, stood rigid near the edge of the dance floor, his expression tight with restrained calculation. Clara saw recognition flash across his face when his gaze shifted toward her. Alexander approached without hesitation. Though she could not hear every word exchanged between the two men, she saw the tension in Hargrove's posture, the way his jaw tightened as Alexander spoke. Moments later, Alexander gestured subtly for Clara to join them. She crossed the polished floor with unhurried steps, aware that the surrounding guests were pretending not to observe. "Miss Bennet," Hargrove said, forcing civility into his tone, "I trust your situation has been resolved." Clara met his gaze steadily. "It has," she replied. "Completely." Hargrove's eyes flicked toward Alexander. "The debt was substantial," he said carefully. "It would be unfortunate if further discrepancies were discovered in prior agreements." The implication lingered. Thinly veiled, Alexander's response was calm but firm. "All prior agreements have been reviewed," he said, "and corrected where necessary." The word corrected settled heavily. Clara sensed that this was not a spontaneous confrontation. Alexander had anticipated it. Hargrove adjusted his cuffs, composure returning like a mask. "Of course," he said. "Clarity benefits everyone." As he stepped away, the air around them felt clearer, as though a silent challenge had been met and dismissed. Clara turned to Alexander once they stood alone. "He does not relinquish leverage easily," she said quietly. "No," Alexander agreed. "But he no longer holds it over you." She studied him, understanding dawning slowly. "You investigated the contract," she said. He held her gaze without apology. "There were irregularities," he admitted. "They will not resurface." Clara felt a complex wave of gratitude and unease. "You could have ended this quietly without involving me further," she said. "I could have," he replied. "But that would not have been honest." Music resumed softly, signaling the close of formalities. Guests began to collect coats and exchange final pleasantries. Clara realized that the night had tested more than appearances. It had tested allegiance. As they exited into the crisp air, the town hall glowing behind them, she paused on the steps. "You did not have to stand beside me so openly," she said. Alexander looked out across the quiet street, then back at her. "Yes," he answered. "Simply, I did." The carriage door closed behind them, wheels rolling steadily over the darkened road, and as the lights of the town faded into distance, Clara understood that whatever battles had once been fought in silence were no longer hers to face alone. The carriage ride back to Whitmore Manor unfolded in contemplative silence, the rhythmic sound of wheels against the road steady and grounding. Clara watched the dark countryside pass beyond the window, faint reflections of lantern light flickering across the glass like unspoken thoughts. Inside the carriage, the space between her and Alexander felt altered, not tense, not uncertain, but aware. When they arrived at the manor, the front doors opened before the carriage had fully stopped, warm lights spilling onto the gravel drive. The house seemed to receive them differently tonight, as though it too had witnessed what had transpired. Once inside, Clara removed her gloves slowly, the quiet echo of the hall amplifying each subtle movement. Alexander dismissed the staff with a nod, ensuring they would not linger. The silence that followed was not imposed but chosen. "You handled yourself well," he said, his voice low but sincere. Clara met his gaze. "So did you." He moved toward the fireplace in the main sitting room, stirring the embers back to life with measured care. The flames rose, casting a softer glow across his features, revealing not calculation, but something closer to relief. "Hargrove will not interfere again," he said. "The contract. Discrepancies were deliberate. I have ensured they are resolved." Clara stepped closer, drawn by the warmth and the honesty in his tone. "You protected me," she said quietly. He did not deny it. "I protected what I chose," he replied. The distinction lingered between them. Clara felt the weight of that choice settle deeper than any document they had signed. Outside, the wind had stilled entirely, the night calm and clear. "I agreed to stay because I believed I could endure it," she said after a moment. "I did not expect." Her voice faltered, not from fear, but from realization. Alexander closed the remaining distance between them, stopping just within arm's reach. "You did not expect what?" he asked softly. Clara held his gaze, steady despite the vulnerability rising within her. To feel respected. The admission hung in the air, fragile yet undeniable. Alexander's expression shifted. the careful composure giving way to something more personal. "You were never meant to feel otherwise," he said. "Not here." The firelight reflected in his eyes, steady and unwavering. Clara became acutely aware of the space between them, of the quiet rhythm of her own breathing, of the fact that what bound them now extended beyond necessity. "This began as negotiation," she said. "It is no longer that." He did not step back. "No," he agreed. "It is not." The silence that followed was neither awkward nor urgent. It was deliberate. Clara realized that fear had driven her to his gates, but choice had kept her here, and now something else entirely was beginning to take root, quiet but resolute. Alexander lifted his hand, hesitating only briefly before allowing his fingers to brush against hers, not claiming, not demanding, simply present. The contact was gentle, a question rather than a command. Clara did not withdraw. Instead, she allowed her hand to rest lightly against his, her decision clear without words. Beyond the windows, the estate lay still beneath a sky scattered with stars, the storm a distant memory. Within the manor, two futures that had once stood in opposition now moved toward the same horizon, and as the fire burned steadily between them, Clara understood that what she had entered in desperation was becoming something chosen with intention. Morning arrived with a clarity that felt almost fragile, as though the quiet of the night before had been preserved in glass. Clara stood at the tall window of the east wing, sunlight spilling across frost-edged panes, and watched the estate wake beneath a pale winter sky. The storm was gone entirely now, replaced by still air and fields touched with silver. Behind her, Whitmore Manor carried on with its measured rhythm, yet she sensed something beneath it, an undercurrent of anticipation, when a discreet knock sounded at her door. She turned to find the housekeeper holding a sealed envelope on a silver tray. "This was delivered at first light," the woman said softly. Clara accepted the envelope, recognizing the bold handwriting immediately. "Thomas Hargrove." She broke the seal carefully, scanning the brief but pointed message. It referenced an overlooked clause in her late husband's original agreement, one that could, in theory, reopen scrutiny over past transactions. The language was courteous, yet edged with implication. Clara folded the letter once, then again, steadying her breath. Fear flickered, but did not take root. She descended to the study where Alexander was already reviewing correspondence. He looked up as she entered, reading her expression before she spoke. "Hargrove," she said, handing him the letter. His jaw tightened slightly as he read. He anticipated resistance. Alexander said quietly. He expected leverage to remain. Clara moved closer to the desk. "Does it?" He set the paper down with deliberate calm. "No." He crossed to a locked cabinet and withdrew a slim folder, placing it before her. Inside were copies of revised filings, notarized corrections, and official acknowledgments submitted days earlier. Clara felt a slow realization settle over her. "You resolved this before he could threaten it," she said. Alexander met her gaze. "I do not build foundations on uncertainty." The statement carried weight beyond legal matters. Clara closed the folder gently. "He will not accept defeat quietly," she observed. "He does not need to," Alexander replied. "He only needs to understand that he no longer influences our course." The word "our" resonated more deeply than the rest. Clara stepped toward the window, sunlight bright against polished floors. "I will not be a point of weakness," she said. Alexander joined her, stopping at her side. "You are not," he answered. "You are the reason there is strength." The simplicity of his words unsettled her more than any challenge. Outside, a carriage moved slowly along the distant road, ordinary and unthreatening. Life continued. "This began because I was cornered," she said after a moment. "Now it continues because I choose it." Alexander's expression softened, not with triumph, but with acknowledgement. "Then we proceed as we have," he said, openly. Clara turned toward him, sunlight catching in her hair, illuminating the steadiness in her eyes. "Openly," she agreed. As the morning unfolded, documents were dispatched, responses drafted, and the final remnants of Hargrove's leverage dissolved into irrelevance. Yet beyond legalities and contracts, something else had been secured, something less tangible but far more binding. Clara understood now that the storm had not only driven her to Whitmore Manor. It had revealed the strength of her own resolve and the depth of a man who had chosen not dominance, but partnership. And as the estate settled into calm beneath a clear winter sky, she recognized that the future before her was no longer defined by debt or desperation, but by deliberate trust. Spring arrived quietly at Whitmore Manor, not in a sudden burst of color, but in gradual shifts that softened the edges of winter. Snow receded from the fields, revealing dark earth ready for planting, and sunlight lingered longer across the tall windows where Clara often stood reviewing estate reports. Weeks had passed since the letter from Hargrove had been reduced to insignificance, and with each passing day the house felt less like a refuge from crisis and more like a home built on shared intention. Emily's health improved steadily under attentive care, and her laughter, once fragile and distant, now carried clearly through the smaller guest wing where she stayed during her recovery. Clara moved through the manor with calm assurance, consulting with tenants, walking the property alongside Alexander, learning the land not as a debtor but as a steward. One afternoon they paused at the edge of the southern field, nearly 200 acres stretching toward a line of budding trees. The wind was mild, carrying the scent of thawed soil and possibility. "This land has always been about legacy," Alexander said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Clara studied the expanse before them, aware of how far she had come from the night she had walked 10 miles through a storm. "Legacy is not inherited alone," she replied. "It is shaped by those who choose to remain." He turned toward her, expression no longer guarded but openly reflective. "You have altered more than my accounts," he said. "You have altered my certainty about what strength requires." Clara felt warmth rise beneath his words, not from flattery but from truth. "Strength requires partnership," she answered, "not isolation." Silence settled comfortably between them, filled not with tension but with understanding. Later that evening, beneath a sky brushed with the first hints of spring color, they stood once more in the grand hall where their journey had begun. The fireplace burned steadily, no longer a symbol of negotiation but of continuity. Alexander reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, simple and unadorned. Clara's breath caught, not from surprise but from the weight of what the gesture represented. "This is not a transaction," he said softly. "It is a promise made freely." When he opened the box, the ring within caught the firelight, modest yet unmistakable. Clara looked up at him, remembering the storm, the letter, the choice. "I did not come here seeking this," she said honestly. "I know," he replied. "Nor did I." Yet here they stood, not bound by desperation, but by deliberate devotion. She extended her hand without hesitation, allowing the ring to rest against her skin as though it had always belonged there. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the quiet certainty of seasons changing. Within the walls of Whitmore Manor, 2 lives once defined by obligation had transformed into something steadier, deeper, and chosen. And as Clara looked toward the future, that stretched before them like open land awaiting spring, she understood that some hearts only learn to beat again when held by the right hands.